Hello, friends. This is Paavo Järvi speaking to you for the fifth time now during this lockdown. And today's subject is Robert Schumann. I can honestly say, perhaps my all-time very favorite composer. I've had a chance to really get into the Schumann's music and Schumann's symphonies in particular by doing a whole complete project of symphonies and orchestral music with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen. And like everything with them, we are always having sort of a total immersion, total not only looking at the music itself, but also everything to do with the background, with additions, with the performance practice, the letters, you name it. And in the process, I think it is hard to imagine that somebody that great, with such an incredible inner world and unbelievable talent, could have been overlooked for so many years as a symphonist. I remember very clearly when my teacher, Max Rudolph, in Curtis, who also loved Schumann, and he said, yes, it's a poor man's Brahms. And of course, we know that today, I guess it is not the case, even though a lot of people who I talk to now and who are great instrumentalists still consider the symphonic music of Schumann and symphonies in particular the weakest part of Schumann's output, which I totally disagree with. But they say, oh, Schumann, of course, great chamber music, great piano music, of course, yes. But the symphonies, and then comes a list of things that is wrong with the symphonies. Number one, it's badly orchestrated. That's something that we've heard since birth, and I've heard it since I was a kid. And every teacher, an orchestration teacher, and everybody always talked about how bad is the orchestration of Schumann. And then came all these debates about who should reorchestrate it, and is it okay to tamper with music and redo certain things that Schumann did. And at the end, I think the general consensus was that yes, it is okay to help out a great composer to make his music playable. And very often when you listen to the interpretations of great old conductors, for example, a very good Schumann interpreter is George Zell. You hear how he takes out a certain doubling notes, a certain things he doubles in the winds, plays with dynamics and so on, and the whole process actually is there to make it sound a little bit more coherent and make it sound a little more like Brahms. And I think that's where the big problem starts, is because people somehow felt that it doesn't quite live up to Brahms. And in my opinion, that's the wrong starting point. That's exactly what's wrong with the whole theory of Schumann, because it's not Brahms, and it is not supposed to sound like Brahms. And there is no point in working so hard in trying to curve and smooth all the rough edges. In fact, one of the great things about Schumann are those rough edges, this incredibly neurotic subito fortissimo sforzati, the kind of wounded sforzati, and all the euphoria that comes seemingly out of nowhere, and all of the so-called awkward moments. These are the moments that I love most in Schumann's music. And so when we started to record and do the project with Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie, we actually really looked at the very starting point of how big is the orchestra? Why is it always considered badly orchestrated? Is it something that perhaps we are doing or overlooking, doing wrong? And of course, the size of the orchestra, of the modern symphony orchestra, is totally overblown, too big to make the Schumann's intimacy and intimate moments come alive. But also balance-wise, if you have let's say 18 or 16 first violins, then you need to double the winds, and then you need, and then everything becomes heavier and everything becomes so much more static. So this neurotic and this man of poetry that we can so clearly see from his writings, his letters, his correspondence to other musicians, somehow gets lost because there is a desire to make it sort of grand and Brahmsian. What are your experiences with orchestral music of Schumann? I have always now learned to show up with my own set of parts, because there are inevitably one needs to have a readjustment in some dynamics, and also when you're using the modern trumpets, when you're using the modern brass and horns, there is going to be a certain number of balance issues that needs to be fixed. I always, for Schumann, but also the same thing with Bruckner, I come with my own parts, and 90% of the work already then is done in preparation. Let's see some questions now. Which one of all his orchestral works, which one of the symphonies is your favorite to conduct and listen? I must say, I grew up thinking that the fourth was the best symphony, and that was also considered the most successful symphony by the skeptics, so to speak. And today, as much as I love the fourth, I actually always look forward to conducting the other ones more. I have discovered and fallen in love again with the Rheinische, with the third symphony, and often conduct the symphony, and it's always a joy. The second symphony maybe is the most amazing piece he ever wrote. The slow movement, the melancholy, the kind of deep sadness that's in this music, and the joy that the finale all of a sudden spring to life, and so I would say the second, but all of them are really marvelous, and it's funny because there are certain composers that you can go simply to an orchestra, let's say Tchaikovsky, and it will always sound more or less decent, and then you have to work to make it sound exceptional, but the starting point is always decent. With Schumann, the starting point is never good. I have never been to a first rehearsal where I thought this is wonderful. It always is heavy, and it's always a little bit clumsy, and unless it's an orchestra, that really knows the style. And like with Kammer Philharmony, we spent 3-4 years just on Schumann. So we don't even talk about stylistic issues anymore. We're talking about musical gestures, but nobody will need a marking that, after long note make a diminuendo, or don't labor the repeated notes, and phrase, go always with a dynamic phrase, even if you're playing an accompaniment figure. So with Schumann, it's very important to have a certain ground work that has been done already in the orchestra, in order for the orchestra to really feel at home with that style. And as a guest, it's a bit risky to take the first, second symphony. The third and fourth will work better because of the more tutti character of that music. You're interesting as to Schumann's skill of orchestration. Two opposite opinions. One is really poor, and the second, at first glance poor, but closer examination skillful. Would you give us your idea? I totally belong to the category of the second group. I think that it is certainly skillful. I think that we have been taught sort of to immediately question his orchestration skills, and I don't think that there are a couple of things to say about this. First of all, the orchestration, just like we talked about the Haydn in last talk, orchestration and the expectation from a composer of what composer leaves to the performer, what kind of work does he leave to a performer, and what is already written in the score. That needs to be clarified, because I think Schumann in general wrote general dynamics, general gestures, because he understood that people in the rehearsals and people who will perform will use their musical skills and talent in order to fix those issues, and that's why the rehearsals are there for. If you are living in today's world where everything is taken very literally, and I remember in America musicians say, well, let's just play what's in the score. And if you, sometimes even frustrated musicians would say, like, let's just play what composer writes. With that attitude, you can go very wrong, because a composer's written markings are not always the full story. There are certain and lot of information that is left for a performer, and a lot of that information is implied and it's between the lines and so on. So if you go and blindly say, well, this is exactly what he writes, even though musically it doesn't make any sense to me, then you have to spend a bit more time thinking about this particular place, because if it doesn't musically work, and if you know Schumann's music and you know a lot of other pieces and you never encountered a problem like that, then you have to start thinking, well, maybe I am taking this too literally. Maybe there is a certain how should I say, a certain other approach, which maybe he meant something else. In other words, you have to just do more work on this issue. And very often the very literal approach in Schumann's music doesn't work, because poetry, and this is one of the most poetic souls ever in music, certainly. Poetry is not an exact science. It's a matter of fragrance. It's a matter of things left unsaid. All the nuances and subtleties that are not even possible to write down. So in a way, there is much more for performer to do in Schumann symphonies, and many more issues to decide than in many other pieces, for example, Tchaikovsky. How did Schumann's manic relationship with Clara influence his work? Well, I think that the Clara, there are few incredible women in the music history that are really sort of to say that she was a muse would be almost an understatement, because she was anyway. But the Clara was so much more. There are a couple of people like Alma Mahler and a few other great sort of iconic female figures in the composer's life. The problem is that Clara was a great pianist and an incredibly strong musician in her own right, and knowing the time, and knowing, of course, the whole social fabric of the time, that was not accepted, and that was also not something that Schumann was very comfortable with. And there are even sort of theories by a lot of the musicians or musicologists that they literally felt that Schumann deliberately was trying to sabotage Clara's career by keeping her pregnant all the time, because that was the only way that she could sort of not be in direct competition with him and stay at home. And in a way, there is some possible truth to it. But also, Clara, of course, was a figure, the inspirational figure to him, and a lot of the music probably was written with her in mind. When you look at the earlier time in Schumann's childhood and when he was a young adult, it was an interesting question of which way he was leaning, and what was the relationship with men and relationship with women, and it's a very interesting subject to begin with. But we all know, for example, that Clara's father was very against the marriage, and there were a lot of hidden issues which books are now written about the Schumann's preference, certainly in terms of his company of young men. The interesting thing is that they kept 3 diaries. One was Clara's diary, one was Robert Schumann's diary, and then there was a diary where they both wrote notes and they could read each other's notes. And the same event often is described in 3 drastically different ways. When Schumann was conducting, and the joint diary said it was a wonderful concert, big success, everybody loved it. And then Clara would write, poor Robert, why does he want to conduct? He is not a very good conductor and shouldn't be doing this. And people were not very sure. And then there's a third point of view of Schumann himself blaming everybody else for the lack of success of the performance. So it is interesting to actually read these diaries and compare the events, because a lot of those events are seen from 3 different angles. But Clara was a certainly sounding board, and the sounding board, that's the most important position for any artist, to have an honest and trusted and respected sounding board, somebody whose opinion you actually trust. Interesting question, about a very detailed question about Third Symphony, first movement, just after A. if there is, basically one needs to use a common sense. If there is a wind melody that is hard to hear, then you have two options. You need to either ask the wind soloist to play a little louder, or reduce the strings, or mark down the strings. Reorchestrating means something else than fixing the dynamics. Basically, what we as conductors do, we always reorchestrate if fixing dynamics is called reorchestration. I think that reorchestrating actually means adding instruments. For example, Gustav Mahler in Manfred Overture added trombones, because the three trumpets that are notoriously difficult to play in pianissimo, this three trumpet passage was simply not playable, or playable on a good enough, on high enough level. So he thought, why not add a trombone and take the two trumpets out, so the balance would be better and it's more in the range of a trombone anyway. That's reorchestration. But if you mark up a little dynamic, it would be the same thing as you do when you conduct, and you say a little bit less of this, bit more here. You are kind of fixing the situation as you go along, even in performance. And certainly that is the case with rehearsals. So what I would suggest, always use your common sense. And there are musicians, for example, if the oboist can't play any louder or can't play any softer, so then you have to come up with a solution where rest of the orchestra is quieter. It very much depends on the situation. You have to think really quickly on your feet and try to fix the situation, so that the musical idea comes across and is logical to you. Very interesting question here. Did this legacy of Schumann not being a good orchestrator begin with Gustav Mahler, who felt the need to reorchestrate the symphonies? Is there any merit to Mahler's tinkering? I think that basically what Mahler does in Schumann reorchestrations is basically writing down all the things that any other conductor would do in a rehearsal verbally. It is just that, knowing Mahler being a conductor and a brilliant conductor, knew that all of that information is so much to remember that he would rather write it down, and then it is right there in black and white in writing. And I think that certainly I always look at Mahler's reorchestrations in order to even see and look at what Mahler considered the problem, why he would reorchestrate. I think they certainly have merit. I don't necessarily conduct them from the Mahler's reorchestrated parts and score, no, but certain issues that he pinpoints are incredibly interesting, and they are actually the things that you need to discuss with an orchestra in the rehearsal. And I wouldn't add a tuba, for example, which he did in a couple of places, and I wouldn't necessarily double certain things which he did, but I wouldn't substitute three trumpets with two trombones and a trumpet. This I wouldn't do, but I think that he also had to work with what he had at the time. It is the debate of is the orchestra playing better now, or how good were the orchestras at the time of Mahler. I mean, I think it's without any doubt that the basic level of orchestras is much higher now. So a lot of the things that he needed to do, even though it was a Vienna Philharmonic, it wasn't the Vienna Philharmonic that we know now. It's a different we have gone through a considerable technical progress. Having said that, I'm sure that there's some of the individual players were greater than we have now. So it's not necessarily saying that there were no good musicians. Certainly there were. I just think that at that time, orchestras in general didn't have this level of consistency and brilliance that we have. Next question. What about George Zell's retouches? Would you advise the original or edition? And for Symphony Number 4, first or second edition? It depends on, if you're a conductor, then look at every source you have. At the end of the day, I don't think it makes so much difference. But for example, in moments where George Zell takes away that, the violas are playing a line, and original has repeating notes, and he takes away and adds half a section playing a melodic line without repeating notes and the other half a section repeating notes. This I do sometimes for the sake of clarity, but also so I can hear the melodic line. And it's a matter of taste, a matter of your inclination, and you try it once, and if you don't like it, don't do it again. I do the second version of number 4, the final version. Brahms liked the original version and found that the second version is clumsier and heavier because it was revised, even because the 4th was the first symphony he wrote and then later revised. I also do it simply because it is so ingrained and connects with my childhood. I mean, the 4th symphony is the one we always listen to with my father with George Zell and Cleveland recording, and it somehow was so. It's so much connected to my youth and me growing up that for me that's the one. But find your own. Here it is a very much a question of personal preference. Hello, Derelea. All right. Another question, the similar question, Mahler's version of Schumann 4th Symphony or the original author version, same thing. I think that if you have an access to a Mahler's score, look what he does and then ask yourself a question, why? Then you're already on the right path. Then take a normal score and you have already digested and thought about all these little issues that Mahler was trying to fix. I mean, Mahler didn't fix those things or tamper with them or tinker with them, whatever you want to use, because he somehow had a desire to just correct and fix things and put his name on it. No, he did it because he really felt that it needs help, and if you want to hear the original idea of Schumann, then we need to help him out. It was just the way Mahler was thinking. It was not the same thing as a kind of Berio trying to re-orchestrate Wesseldonck Lieder, which is of course more. It's not idiomatic. It is deliberately trying to plant Berio on top of Wagner, which is totally fine too. It is just that it is not there it's the goal of the composer is something else, is to kind of dress up the piece in a slightly different outfit, which is a little bit more connected to our time. That wasn't the idea of Mahler. Mahler wanted to bring out the intention of the composer, and I am sure that he believed that he's doing a big favor to Schumann by illuminating those passages, by helping the orchestration out in his own way. How much do you believe in the official version history about Clara and Brahms, and how much they affected Schumann's music? I think at Clara and I think this is an interesting it's a discussion for the whole new segment, because Clara and Brahms, I don't think that there was much. I think that there's a possibility that once or twice they have had some kind of sexual encounter. That is, when Schumann died, Brahms moved as far as possible in the German-speaking country from Clara, and the contact was minimal. I don't necessarily really think that there is so much merit to it. I think that certainly there was some, but I think that Clara was a very, it's an interesting thing about Clara is that Clara, when Schumann died, he didn't want to see, just before he died, he didn't want to see Clara. And also he wasn't as connected, and Clara was also almost conspiring with a publisher to keep him sort of locked up, because finally she had a little bit of her own freedom, but there were also some financial issues probably to do with his writing, and the Hollywood story of the romantic love story between Brahms and Clara Schumann is probably a fabrication. It's a wishful thinking. I don't really think that it had a lot of merit. Let's see what else. Hello, Lars. Lars Vogt, one of the great interpreters of Schumann piano concertos, just now joined here. I'm very happy to see you. I remember, I think one of the first things we did together was a Schumann piano concerto with Lars many years ago. Let's see. Interesting question. Is music a coexistence of angels and demons? That you have to ask your psychiatrist. But most likely, yes. That's a good way of putting it. Let's see. A shame that Clara could not create more music, being an Ehrfrau and economical engine of a family for many years. Well, yes, I mean, it is an interesting thing to think about, is how exceptional one had to be as a woman in order to even be allowed to have an independent solo career. I mean, these are very exceptional, very few people. This was basically a man's world, and it was something, women were at home, and there you have this extraordinarily talented and also successful and widely beloved soloist. I mean, that part definitely had a very strong influence on Schumann's behavior and his motivation in somehow trying to stay a step ahead. I think that we now take it for granted that women are equal partners on the concert stage. That was not the time. It was very unusual, and therefore therefore, who would have known? We can only guess what music and how much she could have written, or how much music Alma Mahler would have written, and many others. There's a whole list of incredibly talented women who basically were suppressed or born in a wrong time. Where can you find the Mahler's orchestrations? They are all published. They're all published, and if you go on Google and look at Mahler's orchestration of Schumann symphonies, publisher, and you will see that they are all published. There are also interesting things like Beethoven quartets that Mahler reorchestrated, and they are also available for hire. So all of the music that Mahler was involved with is now officially published. Just go on Google and you find out. Let's see. Thank you very much. It says, I was on your concert in Vienna. It was incredible. Zurich Orchestra sounds amazing. Yes, they're one of the best. I love the Tonhalle's ability to just mobilize like it. I very seldom have I seen this type of energy and quality. There is a lot of musical inner culture in this orchestra. I'm very, very happy that I could be part of this fantastic orchestra. Apart from recordings, I really love to listen to Schumann symphonies by Sawallisch. Do you have other suggestions that we should definitely listen? For me, the Sawallisch symphony, Schumann symphonies, and if I'm not mistaken, it was with Dresden, were actually the first symphonies recordings, first of the Schumann symphony recordings that totally opened my eyes. Somehow I felt that yes, this is a great composer. I even after listening to a lot of the older, we discussed George Szell and a few others. It was the Sawallisch for me as well, and there is certain logic. There are a couple of things that Sawallisch was a kind of an underestimated conductor a little bit, because he was a great maestro and a great Kapellmeister, and of course widely respected as such, but somehow not so often mentioned when one was talking about the great stars of conducting world and great interpreters. But I remember when I was in Curtis, and it was just the first 2 years when Mutti was a music director, and then when Sawallisch came, and you could see how the sound of the orchestra changed like this immediately. This beautiful German conducting technique, everything was singing, everything was breathing, the Auftakts were all just effortless and beautiful without any forcing, and total control of the repertoire. I remember him doing Dvorak 9 and Symphonia Domestica, which I thought everybody is always trashing Symphonia Domestica. I fell in love with that piece when I saw him rehearse, where he was, analyzing every line and singing to the orchestra. And orchestra were like in awe. They literally were just applauding after each break, before each break. So Sawallisch certainly is for me one of the great interpreters of Schumann. I would suggest, if you are really into Schumann, I would suggest to go to the route of the lesser known Schumann people, if I call it like this. Listen to Honencourt, listen to Gardner. Also, when you listen to the later recordings of Norrington, there is some wonderful and insightful and incredibly surprising things that they find in these pieces when when you start looking in the score, all of a sudden it's like, why did I miss this little detail, which is so important? And so yes, there are the great traditional performances, and then there are the people who might surprise you with a much fresher angle, and this is the same usual suspects of the pioneers of historically informed performance practice. If you want something organic, go for Sawallisch, and also one of the people, another totally unsung hero, but Jochum. Jochum is one of the most natural, also his Bruckners, but also his Haydns with London Orchestra. Really an exceptionally good conductor. Listen to his Schumann symphonies. Wonderful. But, in today's world where you can pretty much press the button and listen to anything, that's a very good thing to do. Just keep exploring. Thinking about two sides of Schumann personality, the Floretta and Eusebius. Yes, exactly. How present is the concept of duality, Schumann's music, and how do you approach that in your interpretation? This is something that is, it's a very good question, because it is I'm very literally dealing with this when I make music interpretation. The question of contrast is something that when we started this conversation, we talked about some people thinking that it was badly orchestrated, too neurotic, overly kind of rough-edged, if one can say so. But these extremes are exactly these two personalities, the Florestan and Eusebius. And one should not apologize or try to hide or smooth the rough edges and the shocking and sometimes really surprising elements in his symphonies, because that will only make everything paler. And once one succeeds in making everything smooth and nice, like Brahms, then you also succeed in sort of castrating his music. You take away what's in essence is so necessary: the conflict, the surprise, the element of drama that is so different in its core than, let's say, the element of drama in Brahms's music. He was a great poetic writer. If you want to have a hint of how to interpret a phrase by Schumann, read some of his letters. Schumann would write that this morning I woke up, had breakfast, and looked outside, and the sun is shining, and everything's great. This sort of sentence wouldn't be able. He would color and perfume every. He said, when the sun rays of sun kissed my eyes, and I opened, glad to be awakened by the smell of spring and hearing. Everything was so poetic and so beautiful and so sort of almost theatrical, and then a phrase of a piece of music has the same license of being interpreted with such freedom and injections of poetic sensibility, for if one can say so. So there is not so much to learn from the people who are too direct in every marking and say, well, this is what he writes, because you need to read his letters in order to see how he thinks and how he likes to express himself And if that's the way verbally he likes to express himself, then the natural continuation of the expression is in his music. No pianist would ever be held to anything sort of direct in the score of Schumann, because we all expect a great pianist to find poetry in his music. Why is it that we don't allow the same process to continue in orchestral music as well? We should expect that kind of poetry, and I think that in a way these two characters are a good starting point, because they are drastically opposite, and they are the two forces that govern Schumann's music making. Hello, Mark. And conductors like Gardner and Norrington transfer those period details to modern instrument orchestras. Gardner with LSO and Norrington in Stuttgart. Absolutely right. And what I really like about both of these conductors is that they have finally now come full circle in their mission in trying to pretty much clean up the dust of history from those great composers, and in a way, in the beginning, it all ended up being in a domain of period performance orchestras. And by bringing this repertoire now to the normal orchestra, so to speak, they kind of have signaled that this music actually belongs to all of the orchestras, and we just need to know the performance practice much more than obsess about exactly what kind of instruments and gut strings are we using. All of these things are achievable also on modern orchestras and modern instruments. How influential was Schumann's psychological condition on the stylistic of his music, in your opinion? Well, I think it has everything to do with that. I think that the kind of neurotic, slightly schizophrenic, I think that there was a whole number of mental issues that he had to deal with, and all of it is, I think, very literally reflected in his music, and one just needs to have courage not to shy away from exaggerating. In fact, if you see something that seems a little bit unusual, a dynamic marking, a strange sforzato in the wrong place, whatever, you have two choices: either to kind of make it nice, which is usually what the older interpreters of that music do, or then exaggerate all the elements that are strange to begin with, and what you end up is so much more vivid and so much stronger performance. So I think that his mental instability had a lot to do with what kind of music he writes, of course. If you go to Uninhabited Island, what score of Schumann will you bring? Oh, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I most likely would bring one of those pieces that I still haven't gotten around doing it, like, for example, Paradis and La Péri, and scenes from Goethe's Faust. A couple of days ago, I got a message from Stephen Isley, said that you listen to the Faust overture, and what a wonderful piece that is. And I must admit there are certain pieces that I am trying regularly to like more, and some of them don't speak to me as much as others, but it's almost with every composer. So most likely I would bring something that hasn't yet revealed itself to me, some of the bigger choral works, perhaps Requiem Mignon. Outside the symphonies, what other orchestral works do you love and feel are quite underplayed? Schumann overtures, this whole thing about the overtures is, the genre of overtures is a little bit, and I think sadly sort of going extinct, because the overture as a genre, that place where we usually would have an overture in a concert, now is reserved for a new piece, often a world premiere, 20th century, 21st century piece. And so an overture, and very often, for example, some of the greatest music written in Germanic idiom is an overture, any overture by Weber. Some of the greatest orchestral pieces by Berlioz are overtures. Some of the most dramatic pieces and most amazing pieces by Schumann. I mean, Manfred Overture is a tone poem. It is, and a lot of them don't have anything but overtures. They were kind of tone poems as we know them now, and they are very seldom played now. And in a way, from a point of view of getting the best of Schumann and getting kind of quintessential the essence of Schumann, if you look at his overtures, unbelievable music. I also happen to love pieces that don't get often played, like for the four concerto for four horns. My father says he likes a piece for three trumpets. Is there such a piece, Schumann piece for three trumpets? Four horns I know, but three trumpets I haven't heard yet. But in a way, all the symphonic music, aside from maybe the Fourth Symphony and Rhenish number 3, Schumann is not played that often to begin with. Of course, you have concerti. The cello concerto is played often, and the piano is played often. Violin is one of my wonderful pieces that I love, but is almost never played, is the violin concerto. We recorded this with Christian Tetzlaff a few years ago, and I absolutely loved that whole process. One of the pieces that I conduct often, also not very often performed, is Overture Scherzo Finale. That's a kind of a miniature symphony in 3 movements, kind of like a study, but it is absolutely wonderful, and it is real Schumann. All the Schumann rhythms, Schumann characters, the melodic beauty, the flexibility of phrase, the rubati, everything that, and then a kind of unbelievably noble finale. It is one of my favorite pieces, and with a very good orchestra. You have to have a very good orchestra because it's technically so complicated that it can often, with a lesser orchestra, could sound clumsy and not so good. But Schumann, the one thing about Schumann is that it is hard to play. A lot of attitudes, I would think, about Schumann's music and the quality of Schumann's music has to do with the fact that it is hard to play and hard to bring off well. And when a kind of medium level orchestra plays it and doesn't do it justice, then people say, well, it's a bad composer, it's not really so great. No, it is great, truly great. In fact, I consider him one of the greatest of German composers, even above Brahms for me. But it needs to be rehearsed, and it needs to be done really well, because it is very difficult to play well and difficult to pull off, so that it really has everything that is in the score. Everything comes out vividly. Schumann called the violin concerto the music of a madman. Well, yes, in a way, I think all Schumann's music, in a way, could be considered music of a madman, because you have always this feeling that not everything is well in his head. His inner world is troubled, and one of the things that I love about his music most is that the sentimentality and melancholy in his music, and the moments of such deep sorrow, can momentarily be replaced by the kind of ecstatic euphoria and almost sort of over the top happiness and positivity. And this is a typical typical sign of bipolar mentality, and it is something that we know that he was suffering from. But in music, to me, it's one of the most attractive and most powerful moments, and this is exactly why we shouldn't try to smooth out the rough edges, because these rough edges are exact the real Schumann. And I don't know. I think that this we often have in Kammerphilharmonie, we have sort of an ongoing gag, because I once called Schumann's music neurotic, but in a good sense neurotic, and one of our very distinguished players came up to me afterwards and said, "No, I don't think that he's neurotic. I think neurotic is something else." And so every time now I say neurotic, we have a kind of an orchestra starts laughing, but I do feel that there is a certain neurotic energy, and that energy is very hard to maintain for very long periods of time. And the performances that maintain this and are able, like conductors who can keep that tension and the kind of almost panting kind of neurotic energy and intensity, are usually the ones who understand and most convince with their interpretations. I don't know. There are some rumors and some people who say that Clara's and Robert's Lieder are very similar, and where they go, who wrote what, and there are a lot of theories about it. I don't know, but it shows that Clara was a very talented composer as well. And maybe, who knows, maybe Schumann stole everything from her. Who knows? I wouldn't be able to really answer this. Let's see what else. Complete works of piano and orchestra in one evening. Yeah, amazing exploration. Yes, there are a lot of pieces. That we don't play. There are, and it's because they are kind of one movement. Piano orchestra fantasies, which are wonderful pieces. And once we even had a discussion about doing a project with Nicholas Angelich with all these lesser known piano pieces, but we didn't unfortunately quite get to that. There are some amazing pieces that we just don't play. It's funny because if you start thinking about the great composers, very few, perhaps, I think even Brahms, but very few composers have all of their works performed and on an equal level. There is always, if you look at Tchaikovsky, how many pieces we don't play. If you look at a lot of choral music of Brahms we don't play. There are even pieces and cantatas by Bach that we know exist but nobody plays. Schumann and many others, not to mention Haydn, Mozart. So I suppose there is a certain process of elimination, and the time is a very strong judge. Time will tell you what survives and what doesn't survive. And even with the greatest of great composers, there are certain pieces simply that fall between the cracks, and not always justly, but sometimes quite justly as well. It depends on the pieces. If you look at the composers of the 20th century who used to be the absolute greats, like Hindemith, for example, who plays Hindemith today, and a lot of the great orchestral music by Hindemith is not played simply because somehow the aesthetics of his music is now as somehow as vital and as colorful as what we need right now. And who knows, maybe in 100 years it will be discovered again as one of the great symphonies. It is an interesting thing to think about, like why we don't play all the pieces equally by great composers. With Brahms, perhaps Brahms is the most played, but because he destroyed all the stuff that he didn't want people to know, and we actually are left with very many question marks, like what happened to this piece? Why do we have so few? Did he really write only this? Because he cleverly, or maybe not cleverly, unfortunately, destroyed all the things that he felt were below par. Brahms-Schumann relationship, well, that's a complicated subject, and how the music was affected. There are so many people who will have a lot to say about this and have theories about this. If you look at the way the Schumann and Brahms met, Brahms was as a student, a young man, and Schumann was a kind of a guru, a widely respected older and very, very influential musician at the time. And pretty much Schumann hailed Brahms as a kind of a savior of symphonic form, and savior of the symphony, so to speak, and he wrote very highly about Brahms in Neue Musikalische Zeitung, and it was all amazingly positive. And at the end there is a sentence which says, and he's also the most beautiful blonde boy in Austria. And it's really there. Go and look at it if you don't believe me. And it is that sentence that sort of have made a lot of people curious what actually was the nature of the relationship, because Brahms and Joachim were the two companions, the two characters that he, Florestan and Eusebius type magnets and polars. And what was the true nature of their relationship? Was it a father figure? Was that a mentor? Was it maybe perhaps more? Because it's quite well documented, all the outings and all the time they spent together, and there is the third symphony of Brahms uses exact quotation of the third symphony of Schumann. Tim pam pam palam. This which Brahms writes his own version of, and dedicating it to Schumann, who I used to know while Schumann is still alive, and what happened to that blonde boy in Austria, the most beautiful blonde boy in Austria? What happened to this reclusive old man who didn't want to see anybody and who never had a real relationship, and who was sort of yearning for somebody, but who was it? It certainly wasn't Clara. That much we can sort of know from the evidence. So what really was going on between these two people, and what was the nature of their relationship, is quite hard to, it's open for speculation, let's put it this way. But at the very least, we know that it was a musical father, and it was a person who taught Brahms everything in terms of all the church music, the choral music. I mean, Schumann had a library that was one of the greatest in German-speaking countries, and the music that Brahms learned from there, and all the, especially the medieval music and church music, is something that we can hear in his symphonies, all the chorales and all the singing and choral influences that Schumann was responsible in introducing Brahms to. So at the very least, the very deep affection and very deep respect for his musical mentor. But I personally suspect that there was more. And I think that one of the sentences that Clara's father wrote in a letter to Clara, he said, "Why don't you marry the banker?" There was a banker who was after Clara, also wanted to marry. And he said, "At least he's a real man." That was a sentence that the father wrote, which is, of course, in code in today's world. We can understand what he meant. He meant that Schumann had a reputation of not being only interested in women. Let's put it this way. And so what were really the nature, even if it was just an emotional attachment, who knows? But that again, I would very strongly recommend, if you're interested, going back to the book I once already recommended to you. It's Inner Voices of a Musical Genius by Peter Ostwald, and that's a book that can be incredibly illuminating. Another thing that we know from his diseases, and we know from his mental state, that he was an exceptionally heavy drinker. So a lot of illusions and delusions and all the mental stuff that we attribute to syphilis, which then later became kind of a death sentence at that time, was a lot of the hallucinations and things like that had to do with him being a heavyweight alcoholic. But that's already going away from the greatness of his musicianship and him as a most extraordinary, exceptional composer. When working with a new orchestra that is not yours, and you're starting a new symphony, what are the difficulties you find? Rhythm or notation, understanding? Well, in general, I think that the weakest, I can tell you in 30 years of conducting, the one thing that I find is universally weak with many orchestras and soloists and orchestras and musicians in general, is a rhythm. Rhythm, which I find is so instrumental and so important. The rhythmical, I'm not talking about figuring out complicated rhythms. I'm talking about something entirely different. A innate sense of inner rhythm, that inner pulse that needs to be functioning, and that heart that needs to be beating in the right way. Otherwise, the whole foundation is just not steady and stable enough. I'm not talking about anything rigid and sort of academic. I'm talking about the sense of rhythmical character and inner rhythm. In no other composer, I mean, needs it more than Schumann. When you have padam pam 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 padam, this, and then typically, usually a second-rate orchestra is going to always talk, well, is it ta-tan, ta-ta, is it shorter or is it longer? They're going to ask all these, and you have to go through it because it's a legitimate question on a certain level. But an orchestra that starts talking about, is it 16th or is it double dotted or is it single dotted, doesn't quite understand the rhythm to begin with, because it is not it is I can't explain it. I never explain it because I sing it, because I cannot. It's not really notatable in the right way, or in a way that everybody would be happy and would immediately understand. But that sense, the issues of articulation and but the inner rhythm, I find, is very, very important to really set straight in the beginning with a new orchestra. Something that is difficult for any orchestra, but certainly as a guest, that will probably be one of the first things that needs to be addressed. Let's see, what other interesting questions do you have? Well, yes, the many parts in Schumann symphonies, violin parts, look like a part that would be very natural for a pianist. And in fact, this is the very big issue, not only for Schumann but for other composers who were pianists and not string players. And in Schumann's case, you can feel how this passage is so organic and easy when you play it on a piano, and something so awkward when you need to actually play it with a section and all together and so on. So yes, I mean, it is something that that needs, first of all, I always tell the orchestra, this is piano music. This is something that is very easy on the piano, and I know how awkward it is for you, but keep in mind that for the musical result, he heard it while playing it on a piano. So we need to make it feel as if it is easy. And so we take it slowly. We'll find exactly how we phrase it. We know where to go from which place to which place. And it's often dissecting a long phrase and making sort of little inner landmarks where you can say, we're going from here, then here, we don't stop, we go here, and here we go again. If you have a little roadmap which is clearly articulated, it makes a lot of these awkward pianistic passages for strings much, much easier. Let me see, what other interesting questions do you have here? Should young conductor explore Schumann's articles about other great conductors in terms of getting better in the musicianship and legacy? I think get as much information as you can, and not only about other conductors, but also about the time in which the symphonies were written, composers' letters, and also letters and observations of the people who lived at the same time, who were witnesses to the concerts, and they're all actually packed with information. And more you read about these things, the clearer and logical certain things will appear. So yeah, I absolutely recommend looking into the letters and if you read Schumann's own articles, you see how he writes something, how the language works, and how direct or indirect or poetic he can be about a very simple thing. So that gives you already some courage and artistic license to use the similar attitude towards interpreting the music as well. Let's see what else. Yes, well, if Schumann was early advocate of kindergartens, well, because he needed some peace and quiet, I suppose, from all the children that he had, and wrote music for children, Kinderscenen. I never thought about quite in that way, but I can tell you that the Kinderscenen is one of my favorite pieces of music, period. I am not aware and not necessarily sure how to answer this question about him advocating kindergartens, but I'm sure you're right. Every parent knows the value of kindergartens. Very interesting question, Felix. In your opinion, what is the Schumann's biggest legacy, merit, contribution to the classical music scene of his time and to that of the future generations? What did he change or influence most through his work? Well, I think that Schumann was a very prolific writer also, and his opinions, his musical opinions, were kind of some of the most important criteria for most of the musical establishment. So he, in a way, was a great musical intellectual whose opinion really created a standard of thinking and a standard of performance. And one could also say that his mentorship of Brahms, in retrospect, probably is one of his greatest achievements, aside from his own music, which I think that I'm not sure how it was evaluated during his lifetime in relation to people like, let's say, Brahms or Mendelssohn and Liszt and so on. But today we know that he was one of the greats. I somehow have a feeling that he knew that he was great as well, and he certainly was very much loved by his inner circle of these important composers who I just mentioned. But aside from writing his own music, I think that his mentorship of Brahms and also his vast knowledge about music that was sort of in the past. It's a funny thing, because we now are taught music history, you are looking always backwards. I don't think that it was such a big trend during the time when Schumann was alive. I think that Schumann, and during that time, it was always about new music. It's all about the music that the pairs were writing. I mean, if one could even imagine that somebody like Bach simply was forgotten, I mean, it is hard to imagine that it's even possible, but it was. And there were other composers that were much more valued than Bach and his sons, for example. And Schumann's knowledge of the past was probably one of the greatest gifts, and giving it and passing it on to Brahms was probably one of the most important legacies and contributions to music in general. Let's see. You spent a lot of time focused on his overtures. Can you talk a bit about what draws you to them? The overtures, it's an amazing genre in a way that, as I mentioned before, I think slightly sort of getting out of fashion, if to be blunt. And we have in our cycle of Schumann symphonies with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie, which I urge you to listen, because this is a I'm very proud of these CDs. And we have Schumann overtures also on the disc with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie. And I must say, it's almost better to think of these overtures as tone poems, as separate pieces of music, and treat them as complete masterpieces, so to speak, rather than a kind of an opening statement to a much larger musical drama. Many of those overtures don't have anything following them. They don't have an opera or cantata or anything. They're just written as separate pieces. And in a way, it's a format of a intense storytelling, which is what attracts me to these pieces. You really feel at the end of the Manfred overture that you have gone through the whole piece, the whole story, and it's told so vividly and so convincingly, and it is so exhausting. I find conducting the Manfred overture in particular, my other favorite that I love is Genoveva, but the Manfred overture, of course, is maybe the best piece he wrote, and I am totally exhausted at the end of this so-called overture, but it's not an overture. It's a tone poem, and then after that you have to do the whole concert still. It's just the first half, but in order to have the intensity and the inner conflict of this piece, I literally find it difficult to do the rest of the program, and very often have to cleverly sort of program things around, so that I have some time to catch my breath. Yeah, I mean, the overtures, if you are interested in the kind of dramatic, real romantic, the beginnings of the real romantic German music, then listen to his overtures. And also, I mean, I urge all the younger conductors, if you love and you look examples of German romantic music, then go also to Weber, because this is it doesn't get any more German. It doesn't all of them have one interesting instrument in common, and one of the most German instruments, and one of my favorite instruments to begin with, is a Waldhorn, as we, for some reason, misleadingly in English called French horn, but actually it's Waldhorn. It's a forest horn, and there is nothing more noble and more virile and more beautiful and mellow and many other things than a sound of a horn. In fact, the horn quartet, this is one of the favorite combinations. I even have here in my library these little green books of the horn quartets that are, every horn player will know what I'm talking about. And this combination is magic. Of course, Wagner, Brahms, Schumann, Weber, Richard Strauss, all the German greats, Mahler, backstage horns, all the horn solos, all the ensembles. There is something about the horn. And certainly Schumann knew and loved that combination and the sound of the four horns playing. Concertstück for four horns is a brilliant piece, and a combination. If you have very strong players and great virtuosi playing this with ease, then hard to find a better sound. Anyway, all of that is in the overtures, and Schumann overtures seem to be neglected and not often played. I urge you to put them in your repertoire. There's a lot of them. Find the one that you like most, and there are some really quirky ones, which I love. But I mean, some people are finding it still hard to digest this, like a Hermann and Dorothea, for example. Wonderful piece, especially if you go to France, then play it. And you have a little Marseillaise, and the reaction from the French audiences are usually very comical and very enthusiastic, because they don't know the story. It's a love story, really. Anyway, the horn and the overtures and the German sound and all of that, if you love all of this, and listen to Schumann overtures, and you'll discover some amazing music. Here, thank you, Maestro. Can I also do a session like this about Tchaikovsky? Didn't we do Tchaikovsky already? In my mind, I have already done it, so I guess we have to do it. Absolutely. And my father writes underneath this, and Eduard Tubin. Now, I don't know, do you know music by Eduard Tubin, but younger composers conductors who are watching this, Tubin is certainly our Estonian Sibelius, a symphonist. So definitely urge you to look into his music. My father is the great champion of Eduard Tubin and knew him personally very well. And as you can see from the comments here, my father is writing, and Eduard Tubin. So we might need to do that. Whose recordings of Schumann symphonies do you recommend? Well, it's interesting that you asked, because one of the best produced symphonic cycle that I know is by us. We had a very, very good producer who is also a great Schumann lover. His name is Philip Traugott. So if you are able to get your hands on this set, Nino, then I definitely think that you should listen. There are some other good ones, but best produced one is definitely this one, ours. Let's see. Tragedy, love, humor, contamination, hope and defeat, Schumann is in Schumann, all is very present and vivid. Exactly, and this is one of the reasons why I love his music so much. Is that while Brahms, you always feel that he's trying to hide something. He never gives you a straight answer. He never gives you, you never see his heart bleed. In Schumann, you do. You see him being incredibly happy. You see him unbelievably depressed. You can see him manic, as if he is, chased by thousands of demons, and then you have these glorious moments of warmth and beauty, and all of that is in Schumann's music, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this talk, because I really, really, really love his music, and I agree with you. It is fantastic music. Did you model your interpretations on an alien maestros? I must say one thing. I model everything on all the information that I have. We are not existing in a vacuum. We are a combination of things that we know. And for me, the way I hear Schumann now is a step by step, layer by layer, every little piece of information you get from every other conductor that has been conducting Schumann before me, every piece of literature I can find, every opinion of great musicians that influences me. If you talk to Stephen Isserlis, or you talk to Christian Tetzlaff, or you talk to Lars Vogt, or the great musicians of our time, they all have their own personal story about Schumann, and you take it in and you take what works for you, and you find certain truths that are maybe something new, something that you didn't even think of before, and little bits and pieces, they add up to what ends up you to be your interpretation. Also, I must stress that I got very lucky with my musical partners. Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie is an orchestra that basically we learned this music together. We went note by note, piece by piece, and we rehearsed and discussed again and rehearsed again and rethought about, so we had a laboratory of being able to explore this music together, and a mindset that is totally free of prejudices, because most of those musicians in the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie don't come and don't play in the established orchestras. They bring their own musical ideas to the rehearsal rather than a set of experiences, collective experiences from the other orchestras. So you don't, often when people say this is a tradition, what they really mean is that this is what we always have been doing for 20 years without thinking why. That's not the situation with the Kammerphilharmonie. So because the Schumann wasn't even so often played, the orchestra didn't play Schumann that much before we started this project. So it was really a kind of a blank page in many ways, and it helped us to kind of discover the truth together. And I think this, in a way, is the biggest gift if you have an opportunity to really explore a composer with your own orchestra and take time and come back to it again and again. Then this is the way to really find your own way with a composer. Let's see what else we have. Historically, which musical traditions lines did Schumann emerge from? Which composers that influenced him most? Well, of course, developing his very own style from early on. It's a good question. I think that I'm not really sure that I can trace a kind of a lineage or direct influence. He was a very prolific collector of manuscripts and music from the past. So I'm sure that a lot of the music, from the past was something that influenced him. But I suspect, and of course I have no expertise in this, but I suspect that, like all of us, I think that he was sort of influenced by what came before him. But also, you look at the circle that he was hanging out with. I mean, hanging out. There are scenes that are described when Liszt would be playing piano in Schumann's apartment, and Clara was there, and Brahms was there, and Schumann was there. I mean, imagine that party of I mean, this is sort of a almost hard to believe that all these gods are our musical gods, sort of hung out together and had played their own pieces for each other, and this, I bet, was a very very strong influence as well, even though it's sort of coinciding time-wise. I can't, and I might be wrong, but I think that Wagner had something to do with it as well. Even though, if you look at, for example, "Ba-bam, bam, bam, ta-dam, bam, bam," the very famous gesture from the Schumann Third Symphony, we all immediately think that somehow he took it from the Parsifal of Wagner, and then you start looking at the dates and you realize that Parsifal was written later. So actually Wagner took some of the material out of Schumann's work. So is it a plagiarism, or is it definitely, this is not something that happened by mistake? All those people were very, very aware of each other. It would be great to learn more about Estonian music. Tamber flute concerto is amazing, and his trumpet, not to say Arvo Pärt. Well, I'm glad to say so. We recently just posted a performance which was dedicated. The piece by Tamber was dedicated to my sister. So I'm very, very happy that it exists, and this is on my YouTube channel. I hope you subscribe, and definitely we will do at one point an Estonian music question and answer session. I only have to think about, would it be better to do it composer by composer, because for a country that small like Estonia, we have an unbelievable number of really fantastic composers, and per capita, if in today's world it's very fashionable to count everything per capita, we have probably more well-known composers than many other bigger countries. So I promise we will definitely do something on Estonian music, or perhaps we pick a couple of the key players, important composers, and do something with them. What else? Miss seeing Paavo perform live in Cincinnati. Thank you. 10 very important years of my life, and I still miss the orchestra, and it's a fantastic orchestra in Cincinnati. I learned a lot from them and developed a lot with them. Thank you for this. Let's see what else. Why are the operas already staged? I don't know. To be honest with you, there are a lot of pieces that don't get performed, like we talked before, and I have been trying to like some of his music more, and because I love Schumann so much, I think I should love everything equally, and it's not the case. Sometimes with all the trying, some pieces speak to you more, and let's face it, some pieces are just better than the others. So the time is the judge. Composer to composer. I just got an answer here that we should do not about Estonian music in general, but take a composer and then take another composer. We'll do that. Well, it's again, it's been a long and very, very nice chat. Thank you for tuning in. This certainly I enjoy it. And I'm amazed how quickly 1 hour and 40 minutes can go by, especially speaking alone. But thank you for great questions. As long as the quarantine lasts, I certainly will continue doing, and hopefully even after, now and then. But it has been very educational and inspiring for me as well, because these talks and questions sort of remain with me, and a lot of the answers come to me later when we already have said goodbye to each other here. So I will see you next week. I'm not entirely sure yet what is going to be the subject, but we'll let you know. And meanwhile, stay healthy and enjoy music, and looking forward to see you next week. Bye-bye.